Thank you for talking to our viewers this morning. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And now the House is about to gavel in for their morning session. Live coverage here on C-SPAN.
The House will be in order. The Chair lays before the House communication from the Speaker.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., January 15, 2014. I hereby appoint the Honorable Blake Farenthold to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Pursuant to the order of the House of January 7, 2014, the Chair will now recognize members from lists submitted by the majority and minority leaders for morning hour debate. The Chair will alternate a recognition between the parties, with each party being limited to 1 hour and each member other than the majority and minority leader and minority whip limited to 5 minutes. But in no event shall debate continue beyond 11:50 a.m. At this point, the Chair will now recognize the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Fox, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Internal Revenue Code allows individuals who feel they aren't taxed enough to make voluntary contributions to the U.S. Treasury. Unsurprisingly, this provision is seldom used. My Democrat colleagues should have considered this fact when drafting Obamacare. The public is beginning to take note of what Republicans have been pointing out for years. Young people who sign up for Obamacare are taking on what amounts to a voluntary stealth tax in order to subsidize older enrollees. As the initial numbers come in, it's clear that this voluntary tax on youth will fare no better than the optional taxes already in law. Mr. Speaker, Obamacare will crumble and should crumble, not because of bad website design or because Republicans don't like it, but because it's a flawed law built on a foundation of unsound policy presumptions. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. The Chair will now recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Quigley, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, next week we will commemorate the life and accomplishments of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. A revolutionary civil rights leader, Dr. King's movement combated the systematic discrimination against African Americans. But Dr. King fought hard not only for equal rights for African Americans, he fought equally hard for equality for all in this great nation. So it is altogether fitting and appropriate that we honor him and his extraordinary life. But it is equally appropriate to honor him by ending what is still legal discrimination in this country, discrimination against the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community. Because denying civil rights to someone based on a person's orientation is equally inherently wrong. We are all Americans regardless of who we love. Why does someone's orientation affect his or her legal status in this country? Every day we continue allowing discrimination against the LGBT community is another day that justice is delayed. I'm reminded that when Lincoln spoke at Gettysburg, he said 77 years ago we formed a nation based on the notion that all were created equal. And they were in a war determining whether a nation so conceived could long endure. But I think what we can take from that is the realization that we have to ask ourselves every so often, did we really mean it back then when we said that all were created equal? This is one of those times when we have to ask ourselves, is everyone in this country equal? Mr. Speaker, we can end workplace discrimination against gay men and women today. The Employment Non-Discrimination Act has 200 bipartisan co-sponsors, and identical legislation has passed already in the Senate. Yes, our colleagues in the other chamber have already taken this small but important step. When will this body step up and defend the rights of the LGBT community? When will the House majority join us in the fight against inequality? Dr. King said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." Yes, the journey may be long, but I believe we can accomplish true equality for all in this country. I ask my colleagues to find the courage to stand on the right side of history. Mr. Speaker, bring INDA to the floor and allow a vote on equality for all Americans. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. ROTHFUS, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today because, like many of my 700,000 bosses back home, I am frustrated with a broken Washington. Prior to joining this House just over 1 year ago, in my work in the private sector and in my personal life, deadlines mattered. If a client needed to start a contract by January 1st, that contract had to be negotiated and signed by that date. Every April 15th, my Western Pennsylvania bosses and myself have to make sure that all of our tax forms are filed on time. And on the first day of school, my neighbors and I make sure our kids are ready to start the year. And every year on May 27th, I better remember that that is the anniversary that the best girl in the world and I exchanged wedding rings. Getting things done on time is important. It's a value we teach our children. Mr. Speaker, there's an annual deadline that the House and Senate have failed to meet with embarrassing frequency. The United States of America operates on fiscal years that begin on October 1st and end on September 30th. Congress and the President are responsible for enacting the annual appropriations bills before each new fiscal year starts. That's how it's supposed to work. Unfortunately, Congress, led by both parties, has only finished its work on all regular appropriations bills before this deadline 4 times since 1977. That's simply unacceptable. 26 years ago, the President of the United States delivered a State of the Union address from the podium just over my right shoulder. During that address, Ronald Reagan noted that the government had just completed another broken and inefficient appropriation season. In 7 years, the President then stated, of 91 appropriations bills scheduled to arrive on my desk by a certain date, only 10 made it on time. Last year, he continued, of the 13 appropriations bills due by October, none of them made it. Instead, we had 4 continuing resolutions lasting 41 days, then 36 days, and 2 days, and 3 days. President Reagan then held up 3 stacks of paper totaling 45 pounds, which authorized the spending of hundreds of billions of taxpayer dollars, and reminded the Congress that it had only 3 hours to review the documents. After recounting this dysfunctional history, President Reagan pleaded, Congress shouldn't send another one of these. Some may argue that process is not important. It is the policy that matters. Mr. Speaker, process is important because inside the process, the policy happens. Our Constitution gives Congress the power to tax and spend. Exercising this spending power requires due deliberation and should allow for individual members on both sides of the aisle to challenge expenditures, including whether any particular expenditure is too much, too little, or should be made at all. Those challenges should come in the form of amendments that will be debated on this House floor. It is the process by which the people of this country have the opportunity to have a say in how their hard-earned tax dollars are spent. More than 3 months into the fiscal year, we are now heading toward a vote on what is known as an omnibus. This bill collapses all 12 regular appropriations bills into a single behemoth. We are at this point today because the House and Senate did not complete the regular appropriations process on time. Instead of voting 12 times on individual appropriations bills and hundreds of times on amendments to those bills, members of this House will only vote once. Under this arrangement, important and necessary spending is held hostage to questionable and wasteful spending. Last year, the House only passed 4 spending bills on time, and the Senate passed none. This must stop. Congress must get its work done on time. Today, I'm introducing the Congressional Pay for Performance Act of 2014. This simple bill will hold Congress accountable and force us to comply with deadlines, just like the people in the real world do outside of Washington, D.C. This is how it would work. Each House of Congress must pass a budget resolution by April 15th or have its pay withheld. Then, each House of Congress must pass all 12 appropriations bills by July 31st or have its pay withheld. It would then have 2 months to reconcile the bills between the two houses. If Congress is not performing its core constitutional duties in a timely manner, it should not get paid until its work is done. Let this year's omnibus be the last one, for Congress shouldn't send another one of these to the President. I thank the Speaker, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The Chair will now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, we live in the richest country in the history of the world, and yet hunger is a problem in the United States of America, a very costly problem. A recent report published in the journal Health Affairs shows that poor people are getting sick because they are running out of food at the end of the month. Hunger increases the likelihood that people will get other ailments. Specifically, this analysis shows that poverty and exhausted food budgets may be a reason for increased health risk due to dangerously low blood sugar. We know that poor families prioritize which bills they pay and that food, grocery bills, often fall behind other responsibilities like rent and utilities. And I ask unanimous consent to insert an article from the New York Times titled "Study Ties Diabetic Crisis to Dip in Food Budgets" into the record at the end of my statement.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, this year marks the 50th anniversary of the War on Poverty. One of the programs that is key in this war on poverty in our attempt to reduce and eliminate income inequality is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Act, or SNAP, formerly known as food stamps. SNAP is a lifeline for 47 million Americans. 47 million of our fellow citizens rely on this program to help put food on the table for their families. But SNAP has become a major target in this Congress by those who believe it is simply a government handout. SNAP is many things, but it is not a poorly run government handout. To the contrary, it is a program that is among the most efficient and effective, if not the most efficient and effective, of federal programs. Despite this fact, and despite the fact that millions of Americans turned to SNAP precisely because they saw their incomes drop or disappear because of the recession, SNAP was cut by $11 billion on November 1st, 2013. And on top of that, we are told that the Farm Bill that is still in negotiation would cut another $8.5 to $9 billion above that November 1st cut. These cuts have real impacts. Some families who already saw a cut of $30 a month on November 1st will see their SNAP benefit cut by another $90 a month if the Farm Bill passes with these cuts. That's a cut of $120 a month for a family of 3 in a state like California or Massachusetts or New York, for example. According to a study conducted by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the Pew Charitable Trust, a cut of $2 billion a year in food stamps could trigger an increase in $15 billion in medical costs for diabetes over the next decade. The insistence of many in this Congress, Republicans and, I'm sad to say, some Democrats, that SNAP be cut will have serious long-term impacts on the health of poor people who are just trying to get by. And any cuts will cost us more. They will save us nothing. Being poor is hard. It is expensive. We shouldn't be making the lives of those who struggle with poverty even harder by cutting safety net programs like SNAP. We should not be making poor people sicker because we want to cut federal spending on SNAP while increasing spending for the Defense Department or giving corporate welfare in the form of crop insurance or other farm subsidies. Many of these these excesses are contained in the Farm Bill that we may see in the next couple of weeks. I oppose the SNAP cuts included in the Farm Bill. They are misguided, they are hurtful, and they are wrong. They will do real damage to real people who just want to earn a paycheck and provide for their families. I urge my colleagues to stand with me and oppose this Farm Bill if, in fact, it contains these $8 to $9 billion in cuts in SNAP. I would remind my colleagues that behind all these numbers and behind all the statistics and behind all the rhetoric, there are real people. These cuts have already been made actually hurt people. Let's not pile on. Anti-hunger advocates have warned that further cuts to SNAP will increase hunger in America. Go to any food bank in America. They are at capacity right now. Leading economists have told us that further cuts to SNAP will undermine our economy. SNAP is actually a stimulus. People who get SNAP actually have to spend it on food. It helps our economy grow. And doctors and medical researchers have documented time and time and time again with a gazillion studies that further cuts to SNAP will cause avoidable health care costs to millions of our fellow citizens. Sometimes I wonder when we have these debates whether anybody's paying attention. My question to this Congress is anybody listening? Why would anybody cut this program more and more and more and more? Why are so many in this chamber so indifferent to this problem that affects close to 50 million of our fellow citizens? I plead with my colleagues to say no to any further SNAP cuts. And I appeal to this administration to work with Congress to develop a plan so that nobody in this country goes hungry. The silence on this issue in this Congress and in this administration is sad, and it is a missed opportunity to do something meaningful and positive for millions of our fellow citizens. We can do more, we can do better, we can end hunger now, but not by coldly, callously, and arbitrarily cutting SNAP. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes now the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. LANKFORD, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the past month since September 11, 2012, we've learned a great deal about what happened in Benghazi that fateful night when Chris Stevens, Sean Smith, Glenn Daughtry, and Tyrone Woods were murdered in our facility. Their work to make the world safer and to build peaceful relationships was met with aggression and brutality. But while we have some answers, I grow weary of asking many questions over and over again in hearings, letters, and on this floor to get some very basic answers for the families and for the American people. Let me run some of those questions past us again. It was known within the State Department and at the highest levels that neither facility in Libya, the one in Tripoli or the one in Benghazi, met the minimum physical security standards set after our embassy was attacked in Kenya in 1998. Who made the decision to put so many American diplomats in facilities that did not meet that standard? That same question is asked actually yesterday by a Senate Committee Intelligence report asking the same question. Who made the decision to put people in facilities we knew did not meet the minimum security standards? The embassy had access to additional military personnel for security and training. They had been there for a long time. The regional security officer and the ambassador requested to keep the additional security on the ground. That request was denied in August of 2012, and in September of 2012 there was an attack on our facility, and we did not have the manpower to repel them. What was the reason for the decision to remove the existing security force from Libya and leave only a small security team there? In fact, the security force was so small that when the ambassador traveled in Tripoli, it took the entire security team just to travel with him. So for long stretches during the day, the American diplomats were completely exposed. So exposed, the diplomats asked the security forces to train them how to use a gun so they could defend themselves in the moments when they were left with no defense. In a country that's just gone through a brutal, long civil war, and there was no strong central government or national police force, why were diplomats left to defend themselves in Tripoli? Multiple intelligence reports from the CIA, the ambassador, and the regional security officer all noted increasing violence in Benghazi and terrorist training camps nearby. There were more than 20 security incidents in that area in the previous month. Every other international facility in Benghazi closed in the previous year because of security risks. Their facility or personnel was attacked. They made the determination of one of two things: either increase security or pull out. They chose to pull out. We had the same option, but instead we chose to stay and decrease our security. Who made that decision, and what information did they use to make that decision? We have a joint operation called the Foreign Emergency Support Team to assist during and after State Department crisis. They never mobilized that night because no one ever sent them. Apparently, they were too far away. They were stationed in the United States. Can someone tell me why we have a foreign emergency support team if they're not for events like this? What level of attack is required to mobilize that team? If they're too far away to make a difference, why are they stationed in America? We're not worried about our embassies in America being attacked. We spend millions of dollars training and equipping this team to apparently stand down during an emergency. Why? On September the 11th, our American embassy in Egypt was stormed about 6 o'clock local time. The mob climbed the walls, put up the al-Qaeda flag. I would assume it's an event that would warrant some sort of status change in our military preparedness, but no one from the State Department requested a status change or increased preparedness. So when the country next door was attacked 4 hours later, the military still was not prepared. There are millions of questions about what happened that night. Why were we overwhelmed by let me say it again. Were we overwhelmed by highly organized military force? Was it a street protest that went violent like the administration first claimed? The administration claims the attack was so overwhelming, additional American security forces would not have made a difference. I know how we can resolve this issue. Release the video of that attack that night. For some reason, the administration cannot identify the killers that night because none of them have been brought to justice a year and a half later. I have an idea. If the administration cannot identify them, show the world the video of the attack and let everyone see it and let the world help identify who that is. If there's a bank robbery, the next day the video footage is on television so that everyone can figure out who that person is and they can be brought to justice. That's standard practice for the FBI here. Why is the video of the attack in Benghazi being withheld? If you cannot figure out who attacked the compound, ask CNN or Fox News or the New York Times. They've all interviewed the people who attacked the compound, but the administration can't seem to find them. Many Americans have not even heard there is high-quality, multiple-angle video footage of that night, both on the ground and from the air in drones. There's only one reason why the administration will not release the video. They do not want the American people to see what really happened that night and to see that 2 additional security personnel would have made a huge difference. We need to release the video. Allow the American people to see what really happened. Let's get these questions answered. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Schiff, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, the political standoff between the 2 main political parties in Bangladesh has rocked that country and threatened its democracy, its stability, and its economic progress. Throughout 2013 and the run-up to elections last week, a series of general strikes paralyzed Bangladesh, and hundreds were killed in clashes between rival political factions. Opposition leaders and human rights activists were arrested, and Bangladeshi courts were used to target opposition figures and their sympathizers. The feud in Bangladesh pits Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, the leader of the ruling Awami League Party, against Khaleda Zia, a former Prime Minister who is the leader of the opposition Bangladesh Nationalist Party, or BNP. The leaders, known to their countrymen as the 2 ladies, have dominated Bangladeshi politics since democracy was restored in the mid-1990s, when Hasina's Awami positioned itself as secular and social democratic in ideology, and Zia's BNP as more centrist and religious. Tense relations between the 2 women and their supporters were further inflamed last year when a third party allied with BNP was barred from participating in the elections, and the government declined to dissolve itself in favor of a caretaker government that would exist only to supervise the elections. This had been the custom in Bangladesh in prior elections. Prime Minister Hasina's actions convinced Ms. Zia the BNP would be better served by boycotting the polling, which the BNP did in the hopes that the government would be pressured into resigning before the vote. When the government did not accede to the BNP's demands, the opposition took to the street. But the government held firm, and amid diminished voter turnout and widespread violence, Awami swept last week's vote, deepening the crisis. Born from a brutal civil war in 1971, Bangladesh has faced enormous challenges in its 43-year history: endemic poverty, one of the densest populations in the world, and unpredictable weather that both sustains and destroys the country's year-round agricultural production. Governance, too, has been a challenge, with the country consistently ranked among the world's most corrupt and the nation's institutions highly politicized. And nothing has come to symbolize the failure of governance like the garment industry and its horrific record on worker safety, a record that threatens the cornerstone of Bangladesh's economy. In spite of these and a host of other challenges, Bangladesh has made remarkable strides. According to a report issued by the World Bank last June, from 2000 until 2010, Bangladesh experienced steady and strong GDP growth of nearly 6% per year on average. Even so, about a third of Bangladeshis live in poverty, and economic hardship is especially prevalent in the rural parts of the country. Given the country's history, its recent progress, and the hurdles remaining, if Bangladesh is to reach its goal of becoming a middle-income country by 2021, the question of governance is central and makes the political standoff that has gripped the country even more tragic and counterproductive. Bangladesh's middle-income aspirations are contingent on a significant rise in GDP growth and broad reform agenda, neither of which is possible under current conditions. Fortunately, there is a precedent that could allow for an exit from the impasse through new elections. In February 1996, elections were boycotted by Awami and other opposition parties, and the BNP took nearly all of the seats, touching off a crisis of legitimacy similar to that now gripping Dhaka. 4 months later, new elections were held under the auspices of a caretaker government, and the outcome favored Awami. Now as then, the time has come for cooler heads to prevail and a new election to be called that will give all parties the time and space needed to organize and campaign. The recent release of Mzia from house arrest should be followed by the release of others detained for political reasons. There should be a mutual pledge of nonviolence, guarantees of non-interference in political campaigning by police and security forces, and a pledge to respect the people's mandate. The people of Bangladesh, who have suffered mightily and who have also risen to every challenge over the course of more than 4 decades, deserve better than to be caught between two stubborn matriarchs. New elections should be scheduled, and Bangladeshi voters given a free and fair chance in determining their country's future. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and the chair will now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, the House is scheduled to take up the Omnibus Appropriations Bill for 2014, and I rise this morning to outline my objections to this measure. This is not the regular order promised to the American people, in which each of the 12 appropriations bills is painstakingly vetted. It's all 12 bills rolled into one with no opportunity for meaningful debate or amendment. True, it adheres to the budget that was passed in December, but that's nothing to brag about. That budget destroyed the only meaningful constraint on federal spending that we had. One member said that he's surprised by opposition because, quote, this bill for the 4th year in a row cuts discretionary spending, unquote. Well, it only cuts it by Washington math. Last year, the discretionary spending of the United States government was $986 billion. This measure appropriates $1,012 billion. That's an increase. And it is $45 billion more than the sequester would have allowed. After all, they didn't blow the lid off the sequester because they wanted to cut spending, now did they? So what's this money going for? Well, it increases funding for Head Start by $600 million, despite the fact that every credible study has concluded that this program provides no lasting benefit for children. It continues wasteful Tiger grants, which under the guise of transportation puts money into projects like a 6-mile pedestrian mall in Fresno and streets that actually discourage automobile traffic. It continues funding for the scandalous Essential Air Service that pays to fly empty and near-empty planes across the country. It continues to throw money at all manner of immensely expensive and failed green energy programs and other forms of corporate welfare. Now, we're told to be grateful that it doesn't fund other wasteful programs like high-speed rail. But when we vote for these appropriations, we're responsible for the money that we waste, not the money that we don't waste. The regular order would at least give the House a chance to examine and debate these questionable programs before we cast our votes, but not this process. But do not believe for a moment that they won't be debated after we have cast our votes. This measure will face the full light of public scrutiny in the days ahead, and that may prove to be very harsh indeed. True, the measure makes some cuts, but in many cases it makes the wrong cuts. For example, although this bill reverses the cuts made to disabled military veterans' pensions, it maintains the pension reductions for all other military veterans, about 82% of our military retirees. According to published reports, over a 20-year period, a retired enlisted service member will lose an average of $72,000 of promised pension payments, and commissioned officers will lose $124,000. And the payments in lieu of taxes, or PILT, are not funded at all. That's the program that makes up a small portion of the revenues that the federal government has cost our rural communities as it's appropriated vast tracts of their land. And to add insult to injury, this bill adds roughly $200 million to pay for more federal land grabs, which will cost local communities still more of their local revenues and economic activity. We're promised that PILT funding will be restored in the Farm Bill, which is little consolation. That's the bill that continues to provide massive subsidies to agribusiness at the expense of both taxpayers and consumers. Now, I'm not unmindful of the challenges that face the Appropriations Committee, not the least of which is that the measure must ultimately have the consent of the Senate and the President, which are responsible for the most fiscally irresponsible period of our nation's history. I understand that. But under our Constitution, a dollar cannot be spent by this government unless the House says it gets spent. The buck literally starts here. And as long as we continue to increase spending on frivolous programs at the expense of working families, and at a time when our accumulated debt threatens to sink what's left of our economy, we are clearly moving this nation in the wrong direction. I appreciate the fact that this is a bipartisan agreement, but a bipartisan agreement that moves our country in the wrong direction is still wrong, and with all due respect, I must dissent.
The gentleman yields back. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, I rise to pay tribute to a dear friend and colleague who passed away a few days ago. Trying to describe Earlene Lindsay for me is not very easy. She was not quite old enough to have been my mother, although she was mother-like. She was like a big sister. She and Nola Bright would look after me at conferences and conventions, make sure that I eat lunch, had some milk, and not drink too much alcohol. I got to know her family, her children and grandchildren, and I want to thank them for inviting me to participate in her funeral services. They know that Earlene and I were confidants. We were like family. She was my boss for about 15 years, during a period that I worked formally as executive director of the West Side Health Planning Organization. She was the board chairman. She was my running buddy and traveling companion. We went all over the United States of America, helping to organize and implement program concepts and initiatives of the war on poverty, which grew out of the civil rights movement, the marches, the demonstrations, the Johnson era. She was with Ernie and Gloria Jenkins, Mo Fletcher, Reverend Carter, Bertram Mims, Lehman Reed, Hats Adams, John Harris, Joseph Rosen, Warner Sanders, and others when we organized the West Side Association for Community Action. Earlene was steeped in her church, her family. She believed in God and in education. Earlene was the education leader for what in the mid-70s and 80s we called District 8 and District 9 in Chicago. In a way, she was responsible for a black West Side resident being appointed to the Chicago Board of Education. Earlene was one of several black women on the West Side that we called our leaders. Women like Eleanor Daggett, Rachel Ridley, Beatrice Ward, Ida Mae Mo Fletcher, Mary Alice Mo Henry, Nancy Jefferson, who headed the Midwest Community Council, Julia Fairfax, Bernetta Howell Barrett, Gloria Pusley, Belle Whaley, Rosemary Love, Rosalie Betts, Lucy Jean Lewis, Vivian Stewart Tyler, Reverend Janice Sharp, Reverend Helen Cooper, Martha Marshall, Commissioner Earlene Collins, Congresswoman Curtis Collins, Alderwomen Deborah Graham and Emma Mitz, Representative Camille Lilly, Viola Thomas, Senator Patricia Van Pelt, Commissioner Barbara McGowan, Commissioner Iola McGowan, Mrs. Lillian Drummond, Mrs. Juanita Rudis, Mrs. Lucinda Ware, Mrs. Irene Norwood, Representative Annazette Collins, Mrs. Vera Davis, Mrs. Mamie Bone, Mrs. DeVera Beverly, Mrs. Artensa Randolph, Senator Kimberly Lightfoot, Recorder of Deeds Karen Yarbrough, Mayor Edwina Perkins of Maywood, Illinois, Miss Barbara Minor, Miss Gus Cunningham, and countless other women who have provided leadership and have been actively involved in the struggle for self-direction, community improvement, and self-determination. Earlene went to City Hall, the State House, and the White House. Through her interactions, she walked with kings and queens, but never lost the common touch. Earlene's two main issues were health care and education. She was a founding member of the Miles Square Health Center and the National Association of Community Health Centers. I remember a meeting we were having at the University of Illinois School of Public Health, and as people introduced themselves or were introduced, they'd always be introduced as Doctor, or they'd say John Smith, MSW, or Joy Jones, FACH. When it came Earlene's time, she said that I'm Mrs. Earlene Lindsay, CSTA. There were a group of medical students present. One of them raised their hand and say, could I ask Mrs. Lindsay a question? Earlene said, gladly. She said, can you tell me what your degree stands for? CSTA, I've never heard of that one. Earlene said, common sense, talent, and ambition. And that is who Earlene was. And that is what Earlene has always been. Strong, talented, compassionate, outspoken, bossy, sensitive, caring, tireless, fearless. Long live the life and long live the legacy of Earlene Lindsay. And if she was here right now, I'm sure she would join with Representative Jim McGovern and say, don't cut snap. Earlene, may you rest in peace. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Holding, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, at a time when the national debt is over $17 trillion and growing by the second, the government continues to borrow and spend money that we simply do not have. And each day that we do not address this problem, the American people continue to lose faith in Washington's ability to spend their tax dollars wisely. Mr. Speaker, one of our jobs as members of Congress is to provide aggressive oversight as to how our tax dollars are being spent by the federal agencies. The American people already see the government take far too much of their hard-earned paychecks, and they have a right to know how these dollars are being spent. People across the country are struggling to find jobs and make ends meet. Now, imagine how frustrating it is for them to find out that some public officials are making extravagant salaries and receiving overly generous compensation packages, partially funded by the very dollars that they, the taxpayers, are sending to Washington. Now, what kind of message does that send? It makes the public lose faith in their elected officials, and it's morally wrong. Reports in the Raleigh News and Observer indicate in my home state of North Carolina the executive director of the Raleigh Housing Authority is paid over $280,000 annually and is also allowed to take up to 11 weeks of vacation and compensation time. The Raleigh Housing Authority is funded largely by federal taxpayer dollars doled out by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. The practices at RHA certainly raise a red flag about how federal dollars are being spent by local agencies. Last week I requested a federal audit of the RHA to make certain that they are adhering to the law.
I also joined with Senator Chuck Grassley, who's a longtime advocate for oversight of public housing authorities, to send a letter to HUD Secretary Sean Donovan requesting more answers and documentation regarding the questionable salary and compensation practices at the Raleigh Housing Authority. HUD needs to ensure that taxpayer dollars are being spent appropriately by the RHA and housing authorities across the country. HUD funds are intended for affordable housing for those in need, not for excessive compensation packages. The RHA needs to justify their compensation and salary practices. The audit should publicize how the RHA has spent federal money, how much is wasted, and how it can do to eliminate further wasteful spending while continuing to fulfill its mission. Mr. Speaker, government transparency at the RHA is not just important to my home state of North Carolina, but to all of our government agencies. We are already spending federal money at an unsustainable rate, and we need to eliminate areas where taxpayer dollars are being abused. If we do not ensure government transparency and cut wasteful spending, we will not only lose the faith of the American people completely, but our economy will continue to spiral downward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin, for 5 minutes.
As we meet, 1.5 million Americans are out in the cold, long-term unemployed, and added to that total, 72,000 each week. And estimated, if we don't act, 3.6 million by the end of this year. Why is this? Partly because of myths, and I want to address them. Myth 1, the need for these benefits is over. The truth, nearly 38% of the jobless are long-term unemployed, twice the rate when the emergency program started, the highest ever recorded before this recession was 26% of the unemployed were long-term. Myth 2, unemployment insurance creates dependency. As Senator Rand Paul claimed, it's creating, or it is, a disservice. The long-term unemployed, in these eyes, need to get off their duffs. It's this Congress that needs to get off its duff, because the overwhelming research rebuts this notion. Indeed, unemployment insurance helps people look for work. People have said, we need gas money to go and look for a job. Recipients must actively look for work under the rules within their states. And by the way, the average benefit is $300 a week. Myth 3, jobs are there. Get off your couch, it said. Look. Walmart came to D.C., had 600 jobs available. 23,000 people applied. A dairy in Hagerstown, Maryland reopened. 36 jobs were available. 1,600 job applications. There are still 1 million fewer jobs today than when the recession began in 2007. Myth 4, North Carolina shows if you end unemployment insurance, unemployment rate goes down because people go to work. That's a myth. The unemployment rate in North Carolina went down primarily because people stopped looking for work. They gave up. This isn't America. It should not be North Carolina. Myth 5, 99 weeks is far too many. Actually, the program hasn't had, this emergency program, 99 weeks for over 2 years. Last year, the longest was 73 weeks, and only 3 states had that level. The average nationwide is 54 weeks. And now just 1 of 4 unemployed receive unemployment benefits at all, the lowest on record. Myth 6, you need to reduce the program as the unemployment rate goes down. That's already done. We have 4 tiers, and already the amount of available benefits goes down in a state as the unemployment rate goes down. The next myth, an extension must be offset. This is an emergency program. None of the 5 UI extensions signed into law by President Bush, none of the 5 was offset. People don't need it is the next myth. In 2012, this is the Census Bureau information, this program lifted 2.5 million people out of poverty. The next myth, what we need, and we hear this all the time, is economic growth, not unemployment insurance. Well, the GOP has stymied every key program to assist recovery, infrastructure, whatever. And the fact is that unemployment insurance helps economic growth. CBO estimates 200,000 fewer jobs this year without extension. As we fight in this institution over issues of economic growth, let's not punish the long-term unemployed. I was reading a statement by the president of the conservative think tank, the American Enterprise Institute. This was an interview with him in October. And he said this, I asked, is my 5 minutes up?
Yes, sir, it is.
I ask that the remainder of my statement be placed in the record.
Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman's time having expired, the chair will now recognize the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Fortenberry. The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we so often use the word unemployment that we lose an understanding of its deep social impact. When a person who is really trying hard, is trying very hard, cannot find good work, it causes much duress, not only to that person and to their family, but to society as a whole. Work is dignity, and good work unleashes the creative potential of the person. Unemployment or underemployment so often creates a spiraling effect on a person's well-being. Part of our job as policymakers is to create and support the conditions for dynamic economic opportunity. Yet Washington continues to deal with the unemployment problem through political sound bites and simplistic solutions. These are not getting to the heart of the problem. Across the country, many small businesses are not creating jobs. Part of the reason is the government itself. The burden of the health care law, for instance, and other regulations has dampened entrepreneurial spirit and created a great deal of uncertainty in the economy. This serious problem cannot simply be fixed by an extension of unemployment benefits. If we want to be further forthright and honest about it, this problem is deeper than governmental solutions and business structure alone. It is a fracturing of our society. Many people have been left abandoned and have not had the gift of a formative community around them. They are alone. Mr. Speaker, all persons are made for community. And if someone is cast out into the world and loses the little bit of security they have, well, the best we can do is say goodbye, good luck, here's a little check to tide you over, hope it gets better. No, Mr. Speaker, the deeper problem is a social problem, the fragmentation of our culture. Now, Mr. Speaker, I also realize that in many places in America, there are not the same economic conditions as where I live in Nebraska. We have abundant natural resources, a long tradition of stewardship of the land, and a strong agricultural and manufacturing economy. My state has also been very fiscally prudent, and that's the same way businesses are run and the same way families run their households. And this has contributed to vibrant economic conditions. In Lincoln, for instance, one company has more than 150 job openings. In Columbus, the manufacturing capital of Nebraska, the community has gone so far as to go to Michigan to try to find families with technical skills so they could move to our state. Mr. Speaker, part of our policy deliberations here should be to try to understand this disconnect between persons who are trying and have a real need for work and the opportunities that are out there. Yes, to demand accountability and responsibility, but also to forthrightly attack this problem of isolation in our culture. If we don't, we can just plod along and perhaps slowly get better as a country in the aggregate sense of the word, but much damage will be done to unrealized dreams and the potential of persons to find meaning with the creative gifts that they've been given. Mr. Speaker, I just will end with this. In all fairness, I think we must do better. We must do better here. We must do better as a country than just emotional political rhetoric and find constructive solutions that are fair for all. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. CLYBURN, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. When President Lyndon Johnson declared a war on poverty in his 1964 State of the Union address, the poverty rate in this, the richest country on earth, was 19%. His Great Society legislation, a continuation of President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal and President Harry Truman's Fair Deal, launched a plethora of programs and priorities to serve and protect the neediest and the most vulnerable among us. At the time, President Johnson cautioned that the war on poverty would be long and difficult. But by 1973, only 9 years later, the poverty rate had been brought down to 11%. We were definitely winning the war on poverty. Unfortunately, many politicians found success creating myths about the poor and inventing phantoms like the so-called welfare queen. They popularized a narrative that the war on poverty was not worth fighting. But nothing could be further from the truth. For example, Medicare and Medicaid, both war on poverty initiatives, have made a tremendous difference in the health and security of older Americans and all Americans of modest means. But these two very successful anti-poverty programs, when they were initiated, the poverty rate among seniors was over 30%. Today, the poverty rate among seniors is under 10%. By what measure can one conclude that these two programs are failures? In addition to Medicare and Medicaid, President Johnson signed into law the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. This law launched VISTA, Volunteers in Service to America, Head Start, TRIO, and a slew of other very successful community action programs. TRIO did not fail. In fact, many members of this body on both sides of the aisle would not be here today were it not for Upward Bound, Talent Search, and the Special Students Concerns programs. Lest we forget, about 6 months after President Johnson launched the war on poverty, Congress responded to his call and passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and a year later, the landmark Voting Rights Act of 1965. These two vital laws created educational and employment opportunities for women and minorities that allowed many of us to fulfill our dreams and aspirations. And in the communities many of us grew up in, many Americans were able to vote for the first times in their lives. There is no better way to wage a war on poverty than to have freedom to choose and unfettered access to the franchise. Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., whose 85th birthday we celebrate today, once famously said, "Of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health care is the most shocking and inhumane." The record is pretty clear that in recent years, the #1 cause of bankruptcies to American families has been health care expenses. That is why I often call the Affordable Care Act the Civil Rights Act of the 21st century. This groundbreaking new law is already having a positive difference. It has given all American families the security of quality, affordable health care. But we still have much work to do. Persistent poverty count continues to be a serious challenge, and we in the Congressional Black Caucus are serious about meeting that challenge. Our 10, 20, 30 initiative targets communities of need for effective economic development through infrastructure investments that create jobs and lay foundations for long-term economic growth. The 10, 20, 30 approach, which this body authorized in the Rural Development section of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, proved highly successful. This effective poverty fighter should be expanded to other sections of the budget as we continue the long and often tortuous search of a more perfect union. And I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from Florida, gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Roth-Latham.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, each year the United States taxpayers are on the hook for over $7 billion in contributions to the United Nations. While some of this money is given by the United States on a voluntary basis and goes toward funding some helpful agencies at the UN, a large portion of these funds are compulsory payments over which we have no oversight. Without the ability to perform oversight and mandate transparency and accountability, we've seen entities within the United Nations drift far away from the ideals and objectives it was designed to achieve. One need look no further than one of its main bodies, the Human Rights Council, where just this past November, the UN General Assembly selected China, Russia, and my native homeland of Cuba, where my family and I were forced to flee Castro's communist regime, and where terrible human rights violations have been occurring for over half a century. This is the same organization where a rogue regime like Iran, that had no less than 6 UN Security Council resolutions against it for its illicit nuclear program, Iran was actually selected to chair a disarmament conference. Only in the UN would this happen. It is the same organization that spends a great deal of time and effort adopting resolutions against our friend and ally, the Democratic Jewish State of Israel, while ignoring the brutality of the Assad regime and the crimes that it commits against the Syrian people. Perhaps nowhere is this agenda more prevalent at the UN than at UNESCO, where in 2011 that entity allowed a non-existent state of Palestine into its anti-American and anti-Israel organization. This move triggered decades-old law in the United States that prohibits us from funding any agency at the UN that admits Palestine or any other non-recognized organization into its membership. By recognizing Palestine at UNESCO, that entity is attempting to grant the Palestinian Authority a de facto recognition as a state before it works out a peace settlement with Israel, and it actually undermines the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. The powers that be at UNESCO knew what they were doing when they did this, and they knew that there would be repercussions, yet they chose to test our mettle and our willingness to do the right thing, to stand by our ally, and to stick to our principles, to stick to our U.S. laws. And for a time, it appeared as though they may have been right. The administration has made no secret of its desire to seek a waiver to this prohibition in order to turn the money spigot back on for UNESCO. Not only does it wish to pay nearly $80 million in dues this year, no, but because it chose to remain in UNESCO rather than doing the prudent thing and withdrawing our membership, we've piled up hundreds of millions of dollars in arrears, late fees. There has also been an appetite by some here in Congress to partially fund UNESCO and, in effect, turn a blind eye to this troublesome agenda, all for a designation that studies have shown has a minimal, if at all, economic benefit to the local site. Luckily, Mr. Speaker, we've managed to stave off such a calamitous decision. Reversal of U.S. law on this issue would have set a dangerous example, and it would have shown the world that the U.S. lacks the courage of its convictions and will only do the easy thing when it comes to helping our ally Israel. But I know this won't be the last time that we will have to fight this battle, and I would urge my colleagues to not allow any partial funding or any waiver that would undermine our U.S. laws. I would like to thank my House colleagues who did the right thing and prevented this grave mistake from occurring. We must fully enforce these laws, and we must seek ways to leverage our assistance to the United Nations to force the reforms that it needs, or we have to seek ways to change the way in which we fund the United Nations. Enough is enough, Mr. Speaker. I thank you for the time, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Payne, for 5 minutes.